This video is about Europe's most significant conflicts of the 20th century. Subscribe for more. In the chilling dawn of September 1, 1939, the quiet roads of Poland were shattered by the thundering roar of German tanks. The world watched as the Nazis unleashed the Blitzkrieg, a strategic military onslaught that would redefine warfare. Amongst the chaos, a young Polish officer, Captain Jakub Nowak, tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, his heart pounding as he rallied his men to face the armored juggernaut. Nowak had only recently returned from military training in France, inspired by tales of the Great War. He held a deep conviction that bravery and honor could fend off tyranny. As he stood on the precipice of his destiny, the air thick with tension and the smell of impending doom, he felt the weight of history upon him. His resolve hardened like steel. He would not let his homeland succumb without a fight. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, D. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before a map of Europe, the contours of conflict looming large. The United States had remained neutral, but the growing threat from Germany stirred a fierce debate within the chambers of Congress. Men and women passionately argued about intervening in a war that seemed distant, yet closer each day. Roosevelt's eyes, lined with concern, scanned the map. He recognized that the fate of democracy was at stake. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler paced the grand hall of the Reich Chancellery, his mind a whirlwind of ambition and rage. The Treaty of Versailles had shackled Germany, but now, with the Wehrmacht at his command, he envisioned a new empire stretching across Europe. The air crackled with the fervor of his ideology, igniting the hearts of his followers who were willing to march into a new era, no matter the cost. Back in Poland, the sound of artillery echoed through the countryside. Nowak's battalion took their positions, a ragtag group of soldiers, barely trained, yet filled with fervor. They knew their chances were slim against such overwhelming force. As the first German tanks rolled into view, he shouted commands, urging his men to hold the line. With each barrage of gunfire, they battled not only for their land but for the very essence of freedom. In the midst of the chaos, a message arrived from the Allies. France and Britain had finally declared war on Germany. Nowak felt a flicker of hope igniting in the darkness. Yet, he also sensed the crushing weight of responsibility upon him. Every moment counted. He glanced at his men, their faces painted with determination and fear. They were fighting not just for Poland, but for the entire continent. The conflict in Poland would soon spiral into something more horrifying. The Blitzkrieg tactics were devastatingly effective, and within weeks, Poland fell. Nowak and the remnants of his battalion retreated, forced to navigate a landscape transformed into a hellish nightmare. They witnessed the bestiality of war, the loss of friends, the destruction of homes, and the betrayal of peace. Their unity was their only weapon against despair. In the shadows of the advancing German forces, a young Jewish woman named Lee Cohen hid in her family's cellar in Warsaw. The walls, once a sanctuary of laughter and warmth, now felt like a tomb. Rumors spread of roundups, of families disappearing under the cover of night. Leah's heart raced, not only for herself but for her family. She had dreams of studying at the university, aspirations of a life beyond the confines of her ghetto. As the war escalated, Leah's world darkened. She watched as neighbors were taken away, their pleas swallowed by the night. The Jews of Warsaw were slowly suffocating under the weight of the Nazi regime, their very existence questioned. A flicker of defiance ignited within her. She would not disappear quietly, she would resist. Back in the United States, as the news of Poland's fall reached Roosevelt, he felt a sense of urgency. He knew he had to act, but the isolationist sentiment was strong. With Europe engulfed in chaos, he sought ways to assist without direct involvement. The Lend-Lease Act began to take shape, a lifeline for Britain and other allies fighting against the Axis powers. Roosevelt saw the bigger picture. If democracy fell in Europe, it would soon be on the doorsteps of America. Meanwhile, the German war machine, emboldened by the easy conquest of Poland, turned its sights westward. The acceleration of Blitzkrieg tactics became increasingly sophisticated as they invaded Belgium and the Netherlands. The rapidity of their victories left Europe reeling, and as the French defences buckled, fear crept into the hearts of even the bravest citizens. In Paris, General Charles de Gaulle, a man of vision, rallied his troops. He believed that defeat was not inevitable. He stood tall, defiantly calling for resistance against the Germans. But the looming shadow of the Wehrmacht cast out. France seemed on the brink of collapse. The world held its breath. As the war raged on, the United States became more enmeshed in the conflict. Roosevelt, driven by a sense of moral obligation, began to push for increased military support. He sent supplies, aircraft, and munitions. The American public felt the pulse of war beating stronger, yet many remained skeptical of direct involvement. Months passed as the tide shifted and the horrors of war began to seep into every corner of Europe. With each passing day, loss became a familiar companion. Noah, still fighting for his homeland, found himself leading a ragtag group of resistance fighters. They sabotaged supply lines and ambushed patrols, fueled by the hope of liberation. The underground movement swelled, drawing together people from all walks of life, united against a common foe. Meanwhile, Lee found her place in the resistance as well. With bravery coursing through her veins, she joined efforts to smuggle children out of the ghetto to save as many lives as possible from the horrors that awaited them. Her actions were dangerous, but she felt alive, a small flame of hope flickering against the dark tide of despair. As the war intensified, the scenes of destruction were matched only by stories of resilience. The American forces began to prepare for the inevitable. Roosevelt knew that engagement was not just a possibility, it was a necessity. The echoes of Europe as suffering reached across the ocean, igniting a call to arms that would soon be impossible to ignore. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define nations and reshape the world. With each battle fought, lives lost, and souls tested, the conflict morphed into something more than a struggle for territory. It became a fight for humanity's very soul. As the smoke cleared from Europe, a new conflict brewed on the horizon, one that would intertwine the fates of the USA, Germany, and Israel forever. The lessons of the past echoed through time, forging destinies intertwined with hope and despair. The war in Europe was far from over, and as alliances formed and shattered, one question loomed larger than life: who would emerge from this crucible of conflict, and at what cost? The stakes were rising, and with the world on the brink, the next chapter of this tumultuous saga would reveal the true nature of war and the indomitable spirit of those who dared to resist tyranny. The clash was inevitable, and the ramifications would ripple across history, echoing far beyond the borders of Europe. As the grim echoes of war reverberated across Europe, the German war machine continued its relentless advance. The fall of France in June 1940 sent shockwaves through the Allies, plunging the continent deeper into despair. Noack and his band of resistance fighters had managed to find refuge in the wooded hills of Poland, but their situation was dire. Supplies were dwindling, and news of the Nazis' atrocities hung like a dark cloud over their heads. In a small, hidden encampment, Noack gathered his men around a flickering campfire. The faces of the soldiers bore the scars of conflict, but each one burned with an unwavering determination. "We may be outnumbered, but we are not outmatched," he declared, his voice firm. He recounted stories of bravery and sacrifice, igniting the spirit of defiance within them. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, is a blow against tyranny. "We fight not just for Poland, but for the freedom of all oppressed people." The men nodded, their resolve hardened. They knew their lives were at stake, yet the thought of submission was an affront to their very existence. As night fell, they planned their next move, an audacious raid on a Nazi supply line that would strike a blow at the heart of the occupiers. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the political landscape was shifting. Roosevelt's heart raced as he listened to his advisors debate the implications of a full-scale war. The Lend-Lease Act was gaining momentum, and he felt it could be the lifeline that changed the tide for the Allies. "We have a moral obligation," Roosevelt argued, his voice rising above the clamor. "If we do not act now, we risk losing everything we hold dear." In the corridors of power, isolationist sentiments battled against cries for intervention. Yet Roosevelt's intuition told him that the survival of democracy depended on American involvement. He studied the map once more, tracing the routes of potential military engagement, and felt the urgency swell within him. The sacrifices of brave men in Europe would not be in vain. Across the Atlantic, as the German army tightened its grip, Lee Cohen's resolve only grew stronger. The days in the ghetto blurred into a haze of fear and desperation, but hope flickered among the shadows. She had become an integral part of the underground network, tirelessly working to smuggle families to safety. Each child saved felt like a small victory against the crushing tide of oppression. One fateful night, Lee and her comrades prepared to execute their most dangerous mission yet, a covert operation to guide a group of children out of the ghetto. The plan was to move them through the labyrinthine back alleys of Warsaw under the cover of darkness. As they gathered in a secluded courtyard, Lee could see the fear in the children's eyes. She knelt beside them, offering words of reassurance, her heart aching for the future they all hoped to reclaim. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You are not alone." As they moved through the darkened streets, the tension in the air crackled. A sudden shout echoed in the distance, and Lee felt her blood run cold. They had been spotted. The haunting call of a Nazi officer sent them into a sprint, hearts pounding as they darted through the maze of buildings. Leah's instincts kicked in. She led the group into an abandoned warehouse, praying for a moment of safety. She urged, helping the children inside. They huddled together, breathless and terrified. Lee risked a glance outside through a broken window, her heart racing as shadows moved in the darkness. They were close. With resolve, Lee turned back to the children. "We wait and we fight if we must," she said fiercely, "but we will not give up." As the night wore on, the tension thickened into palpable fear. Outside, the sound of boots echoed closer. Leah's jaw clenched as she prepared for the worst, but she also recognized the strength that had emerged among her newfound family. They were united in a common struggle, and the fire in their hearts would not be easily extinguished. Back in the woods of Poland, Noach and his men prepared for their raid. The air was heavy with anticipation as they gathered their meager weapons, the dim moonlight casting their shadows against the trees. Each soldier carried the burden of their homeland as suffering, and they knew the stakes. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the future. "Remember, we strike hard and fast," Noach instructed, his voice slow but resolute. "We cause disruption, and then we fade into the night. We can let them see us coming." With a plan set, they moved silently through the underbrush, hearts beating in synchrony with the distant rumble of Nazi vehicles. Moments later, they reached the supply route, lined with trucks laden with weapons and food. The sight fueled their determination, and Noach signaled for the attack. Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness of the night. The element of surprise was on their side as they leaped into action. Noach led the charge, shouting commands as they overwhelmed the enemy guards. The air filled with the sounds of struggle and defiance. They were taking a stand against tyranny in their homeland. Through the chaos, Noach spotted a truck filled with crates labeled ammunition. He dashed toward it, determination coursing through his veins. As he reached the back, the sudden sound of a gunshot rang out. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as he spun around, adrenaline kicking in. He returned fire, taking down the assailant before adrenaline surged through him. He was alive, and with every breath, he fought harder. In the aftermath of the assault, the resistance fighters made their escape into the woods, hearts pounding from both fear and exhilaration. They had dealt a blow to the Nazis, but the price of their victory weighed heavy. They were warriors, yes, but they were also haunted by the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a long, arduous struggle. Back in Washington, as the news of the raid reached American shores, Roosevelt felt a shift in the public sentiment. The bravery of the resistance fighters in Europe was a rallying cry, and the calls for intervention grew louder. He saw it reflected in the eyes of Congress, a burgeoning recognition that inaction could lead to unchecked tyranny. The stage was set for the United States to step into the fray, but the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. As European cities burned, alliances formed and fractured, and the specter of war loomed larger, the world held its breath for the next move. Noach, Lee, and Roosevelt were unaware that their fates were intertwined, destined to converge in a clash that would echo through time. The struggle for freedom and survival would unleash forces that transcended borders, shaping the future in unimaginable ways. As the flames of war flickered in the distance, a new chapter loomed on the horizon. The stakes were higher than ever, and the impending confrontation would test the limits of courage, resilience, and the power of hope in the face of despair. The world stood on the brink of transformation, and history was about to reveal its hand in an epic saga of unity, sacrifice, and a relentless fight for justice. In the aftermath of the raid on the Nazi supply line, Noach and his band of resistance fighters found solace in a temporary sanctuary deep within the Polish woods. They huddled together, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a small campfire, the flames dancing as if celebrating their daring feat. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, but beneath that lay the unmistakable odor of gunpowder and sweat, a reminder of the violence they had just escaped. Noach surveyed the exhausted faces of his comrades, each bearing the marks of conflict etched into their very being. "We struck a blow today," he began, his voice steady yet infused with urgency. "The Nazis will retaliate. They will come for us. We need to prepare for what lies ahead." His words resonated through the group, igniting a spark of hope amidst the despair that surrounded them. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the Nazi presence seemed to tighten around them like a noose. With supplies dwindling and the brutality of the regime escalating, the resistance fighters knew their time was running out. The whispers of treachery in the ghetto echoed through the woods. Lee Cohen, tirelessly working to save lives, felt that same urgency weigh heavily upon her shoulders. In the dim light of the ghetto, Leah's connection with the children she had rescued became her lifeline. They were not just victims, they were symbols of hope. One night, as the group huddled together in their makeshift hideout, Lee looked into the eyes of a young boy named David, whose innocence had been torn from him too soon. She reached out, brushing his hair from his forehead. "We will find safety for you, David. Hold on to your dreams." But dreams were fragile in a world consumed by nightmares. As the children slept, Leah's thoughts drifted to the resistance fighters outside the ghetto walls, men like Captain Noah who dared to confront tyranny. She longed to join them, to fight not only for her own survival, but for the survival of all oppressed people. She knew her actions in the ghetto were a testament to her belief that even the smallest spark could ignite a revolution. Meanwhile, across the ocean, President Roosevelt found his resolve strengthening. The Lend-Lease Act had begun to take shape, and as he penned the details, he envisioned a united front against the Axis powers. "We cannot wait any longer," he declared to his advisors, his voice echoing in the hallowed halls of power. The struggle for democracy was no longer a distant reality, it was a fight that required immediate action. With each passing day, the horrors of the Holocaust seeped into American consciousness through reports and photographs. The urgency to intervene grew louder, and Roosevelt felt the tide turning among the American populace. The specter of war loomed ever closer. Back in Poland, Noack and his men prepared for their next mission, an even bolder act of resistance aimed at disrupting the Nazi supply chain further. Under the cover of darkness, they meticulously plotted the details, determination etched into every plan. They would target an ammunition depot rumored to be located just outside the nearby town of Sambra. Intelligence reports suggest that this depot is crucial for the German army, Noack informed his men. "If we can disrupt their supply lines, we'll send a message that we will not be cowed." The men nodded, the firelight reflecting the fire in their hearts. They were prepared to risk everything, driven by the belief that every act of defiance mattered. As they moved under the cloak of night, the tension was palpable. The air crackled with anticipation as they approached the depot, a fortified structure surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by watchful guards. They slipped through the shadows, hearts racing yet focused on the task at hand. Noack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Suddenly, the stillness shattered as a guard's shout pierced the night. "Who goes there?" Noack's instincts kicked in. He surged forward, leading his men into the fray. Gunfire erupted, illuminating the darkness with flashes of violence as they engaged in a fierce firefight. "We need to get inside," Noack shouted, rallying his men amidst the chaos. They pressed forward, determined to breach the depot. The sound of bullets whizzing past them mingled with the cries of the wounded, a cacophony of war that echoed in their ears as adrenaline pumped through their veins. Inside the depot, crates filled with ammunition loomed like ominous towers. Noack and his men fought their way in, taking down guards one by one, their resolve solidifying with every victory. They reached the heart of the facility, and with a swift command, Noack ordered the explosives to be set. With time slipping through their fingers, the team worked feverishly. "Prepare to detonate," Noack shouted, the urgency in his voice driving them to finish the task. As they set the final charge, an explosion rocked the depot, a thunderous roar that echoed into the night. As they made their escape, the depot behind them erupted into flames, illuminating the night sky like a beacon of resistance. They slipped away into the woods, hearts racing with the thrill of their success and the fear of retribution that awaited them. They had struck a blow, but they knew the Nazis would respond with vengeance. Meanwhile, in Warsaw, Lee was caught in the grip of anxiety. News of the resistance's bold acts had spread like wildfire, igniting hope among the weary. But it also awakened the Nazis' fury, leading to widespread crackdowns throughout the city. Lee watched as families were rounded up, their fates sealed in the darkness that enveloped the ghetto. In the dead of night, Lee gathered her courage and made the decision to expand her efforts. She connected with other members of the underground, devising a plan to form a network of resistance within the ghetto. They would act as spies, gather intelligence, and aid in escape routes. Each child she saved would represent a new chance and opportunity to reclaim their future. With the Nazis tightening their grip, Lee felt the clock ticking. The horrors surrounding them intensified, and she knew that failure was not an option. The children were counting on her, as was the spirit of resistance that burned brightly in her heart. Back in Washington, Roosevelt took a moment to reflect on the distance that separated him from the horrors unfolding in Europe. He understood that the time for action was at hand. In a historic address before Congress, he painted a stark picture of the world at war, urging them to support the Allies in their fight against tyranny. "We must stand with those who fight for freedom," he declared, his voice unwavering. "The future of democracy hangs in the balance." The applause that followed signaled a shift in sentiment, a collective resolve to stand against the encroaching darkness. As plans for military support were laid out, Roosevelt felt a surge of determination. The United States would not just be a bystander, they would rise to face the evil that threatened to engulf the world. As the war raged on, the paths of Newark, Lee, and Roosevelt were destined to converge. Each was a piece of a larger puzzle, a testament to the human spirit's unyielding desire for freedom. The stakes had never been higher, and the world stood on the brink of a confrontation that would reshape its destiny. The stage was set for a clash that would redefine the meaning of courage and sacrifice. The flames of war flickered ominously on the horizon, and with every passing moment the forces of good and evil prepared to collide. As alliances formed and destinies intertwined, one question remained: would hope prevail against the darkest of shadows, or would the world succumb to the relentless tide of tyranny? The answer lingered in the air, just waiting for the next chapter of this epic saga to unfold. The crackle of gunfire echoed through the Polish woods as Captain Jacob Nowak and his resistance fighters made their hurried retreat from the burning Nazi ammunition depot. The flames illuminated their path, a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. Nowak could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, each heartbeat a reminder of the fine line between life and death they had danced upon. His men were exhilarated, yet the weight of their victory bore down on them like a looming storm cloud. The Nazis would retaliate, and they would need to ready themselves for the inevitable consequences. "We must scatter," Nowak commanded as they reached a clearing, the firelight fading behind them. "We regroup at the old mill tonight at dusk. Stay vigilant, the Germans will be hunting for us." As they split up into smaller groups, Nowak's mind raced with the implications of their bold action. They had disrupted the Nazi supply chain, but in doing so, they had also drawn attention to the cause. The time for small skirmishes was over. Their struggle would soon escalate into something much more perilous. He felt a twinge of guilt as he recalled Lee Cohen, the brave young Jewish woman working tirelessly to save lives in the ghetto. The two paths of resistance, one armed and one clandestine, were now irrevocably intertwined. In Warsaw, Lee had indeed heard whispers of resistance fighters' bold act. The flames of the depot burning in the night sky had fueled a flicker of hope, but it was also a harbinger of danger. As the Nazis intensified their crackdowns, she knew that each day brought new challenges. Families were disappearing, and fear gripped the ghetto like a vice. But Lee, emboldened by the stories of those fighting in the woods, decided that the time for inaction had passed. With renewed determination, she gathered a small group of trusted allies within the underground resistance. Among them was Avi, a charismatic young man who had once studied engineering before the war tore apart their lives. "The time has come for us to act," Lee proclaimed, her voice steady yet passionate. "We will gather intelligence, we will disrupt their operations, and we will offer hope to those still trapped within these walls." Avi nodded, his eyes gleaming with resolve. "We'll create a network that the Nazis won't easily dismantle." The group rallied around Lee's vision, and together, they began to lay the groundwork for a clandestine operation that could change the tide for those caught in the crossfire of oppression. Meanwhile, in Washington, D., President Roosevelt's resolve was hardening as he faced mounting pressure to send American troops into the fray. The news from Europe was dire. The horrors of the Holocaust were becoming impossible to ignore. Reports of atrocities flooded the press, igniting outrage among the American public. Roosevelt felt the weight of history bearing down upon him. "We will stand with those fighting for freedom," he stated resolutely during a press conference. "We must not let the darkest forces of humanity prevail." As Congress debated the best course of action, Roosevelt rallied his advisors, strategizing on how best to support the Allies. He knew that American involvement in a war was not just a military necessity, it was a moral duty. The Lend-Lease Act loomed large, and with each passing day, the groundwork for American intervention grew stronger. But as he looked at the faces of his advisors, he understood that the fight against tyranny would demand more than just resources. It would require the spirit of resilience and courage embodied by those like Nowak and Lee. Back in Poland, as night descended upon the old mill, Nowak and his men regrouped, their faces grim with the knowledge that they had become a target. "We need to escalate our effort," Nowak said, gazing earnestly at his weary comrades. "The Nazis will retaliate, and we must be ready. We will strike at their heart, their command posts and supply chains." The men nodded in agreement, their spirits bolstered by the flame of defiance ignited within them. As they planned their next move, Lee's network in the Warsaw Ghetto began to flourish. They operated under the guise of normalcy, carefully navigating the dangers of Nazi patrols while gathering intelligence. Lee felt an electric thrill as she passed information to the resistance fighters, each piece of data shot in the arm for their cause. She realized that her and Noak's efforts were feeding into a larger movement, one that embraced hope amid despair. The days turned into weeks, and as the Nazi grip tightened, the urgency of Lee's work grew. The underground network had uncovered plans for a larger roundup of Jewish families, a systematic operation that would leave devastation in its wake. Knowing they had to act swiftly, Lee and Avi devised a plan to alert families to the danger and create escape routes. But as the clock ticked down to the impending operation, their resolve was tested. Trust was fragile, and betrayal loomed like a shadow among them. In the woods of Poland, Noak and his men prepared for their boldest operation yet, an assault on a nearby German command post that would deal a significant blow to the occupying forces. "Tonight we strike hard and fast," Noak declared, the firelight casting shadows of determination across their faces. "This is our chance to show that we will not be cowed by tyranny. We will fight for freedom, for those who cannot fight for themselves." As the men set out, stealth was their ally. They navigated through the trees, hearts pounding with the anticipation of combat. Noak's instinct sharpened as they neared the command post, a heavily fortified structure guarded by Nazi soldiers. Just as they were about to spring the ambush, a sudden rustle in the bushes sent a wave of tension through the group. "Stay still." Noak hissed, heart racing as he scanned the surroundings. The element of surprise slipped from their grasp as alarms blared, echoing through the night. The Germans had been tipped off. Gunfire erupted, and chaos reigned as the resistance fighters engaged in a fierce firefight against overwhelming odds. "Fall back. View group." Noak shouted amidst the cacophony, but the battle had escalated beyond their control. As Lee awoke to the sound of distant gunfire echoing through the Warsaw ghetto, fear gripped her heart. The fight was intensifying, and she knew the resistance fighters were in danger. The sound of boots marching down the street snapped her back to the prison. She had to act. They would not be silenced. She would not let her brothers and sisters down. In the midst of the fight, Noak and his men fought desperately to hold their ground. The gunfire was relentless, and Noak felt the weariness settling into his bones. He directed his men with precision, their training merging with raw instinct as they battled against the odds. Just as the situation grew dire, he spotted a glimmer of hope on the horizon, a convoy of American forces approaching, their banners unfurled in defiance against tyranny. As the Americans engaged the enemy, a powerful surge of relief washed over Newark. They had not fought alone. The world had begun to awaken to the reality of war. The tide was shifting, and with the support of American troops, the resistance fighters surged forward, uniting for a common cause. The clash was fierce, but together they pushed back, fighting for every inch of ground. In Warsaw, Lee had also seen the change. As news of the American troops reached her, a wave of determination surged through the underground network. They pressed forward with their own mission, disrupting Nazi operations and helping families escape the grip of oppression. Each act of defiance fueled the flame of hope in their hearts. As the dust began to settle on the battlefield, Noak and his men stood victorious but battered, their spirits bolstered by the knowledge that they were not alone. Together with their newfound American allies, they had dealt a significant blow to the Nazi command. In the days that followed, the tides of war continued to shift. The resilience of resistance fighters like Noak and Lee became emblematic of the broader struggle across Europe. The bonds forged in the fires of conflict transcended borders, uniting people in a fight for justice, freedom, and dignity. As the world emerged from the darkest of war, the lessons learned echoed through time. The struggles faced by those like Noak, Lee, and Roosevelt shaped the narrative of sacrifice and courage that would resonate in the hearts of generations to come. The fight against tyranny was far from over, but the spirit of resilience had ignited a flame that could not be extinguished. In the years that followed, the scars of war would heal, but the memory of those who stood against oppression would remain etched in history. The world would remember the courage of those who dared to fight for freedom against the darkest shadows, and the legacy of their struggle would serve as a guiding light in the fight for justice and human rights. The battle may have been won, but the fight for a better world was just beginning. In the ashes of war, hope emerged anew, and with it, the promise of a tomorrow forged through unity and shared purpose. The echoes of Europe's most significant conflicts had transformed into a resonance of resilience, forever altering the course of history.